Hey everyone, my name is Bryce, and I'm back with the big beard in this big room to talk about some big albums from 45 years ago. Today we're going back to 1973 to count down what I believe are the 10 best albums to be released that year. And I love this year because there's a number of classic albums that we get to discuss, and some classic albums that I had to leave off the list because of some obscure gems that we'll get into here. So if you've never seen one of our countdown videos before, we go 10 albums deep, we talk a little bit about the history of each one, why it made the list, and in the comments below you can let me know what albums you think should have made the list, what albums you agree with, what albums you disagree with, and that's about it. So let's get started. First album coming in at number 10.
Number 10.
At number 10, there were a number of albums that I considered for this spot, including some very popular ones, but ultimately I wanted to highlight this somewhat obscure gem of a jazz album, Lawrence of Newark from Larry Young. Young was a Newark-based jazz organist who also plays bongos on this album, and while Jimmy Smith was certainly the pioneer of playing organ in jazz music, Larry Young was a pioneer in playing the electric organ in a more modal context. He's played on albums such as the Tony Williams Lifetime's Emergency, John McLaughlin's Devotion, and Miles Davis's Bitches Brew. But on this album where he gets to lead, it has some of the best and most creative uses of an electric organ that I've heard on a jazz album. And this is due to both Young's strength as a songwriter, but also a lot of the influences that he shows. There's psychedelic influences from Sun Ra, as well as African music and Middle Eastern music, and Young goes in and out of different types of jazz, including fusion, modal, and the avant-garde, and it reminds me a little bit in terms of its African influences of some of the albums that Pharoah Sanders was recording at the time, and Sanders secretly plays saxophone on this album, but was instead credited as a mystery guest due to label restrictions. And there's a number of New York jazz greats on this album as well, including guitarist James Blood Ulmer. It leads to an album that has a very strong groove to it, but is still complex. Young will bring in a lot of noise away from the main groove and is willing to drop into silent moments and then come back with this very chaotic, overwhelming sound. But it strikes an excellent balance between groove and dissonance and bringing in all of Young's vast influences. Take, for example, the highlight of the album, the 12-minute Khalid of Space Part 2, where it sounds equally sci-fi and Middle Eastern and it has so many variables upon its initial groove. It's both slick and hard-hitting. And despite how wonderful this album is, it never really saw an audience when it came out. Part of this was because Young tragically passed away just 5 years after its release, but it's also because Perception Records, who released it, ended up going out of business just a year later, and this album was only released as a promo when it came out. Thankfully, it was re-released 30 years later, so nowadays we can go back and listen to this underappreciated jazz classic.
Number 9.
At number 9, we have Quadrophenia, the 6th album and second rock opera from legendary British rock band The Who. Of course, their first rock opera being Tommy, one of the most successful and overall best concept albums ever released. And Quadrophenia came directly after a more traditional classic, Who's Next, so needless to say, this album had a lot to live up to. And with a massive 80-minute length and all sorts of motifs throughout the album, it was easily the most ambitious record that The Who had crafted, and it ended up being adapted into a movie in 1979. The story is largely centered around a conflict between mod culture, essentially suit-wearing, Vespa-driving Brits of the time, and Britain's long-haired punk rockers. The main character is Jimmy from Brighton, who has split personalities, specifically 4, one for each band member, who all have one song dealing with that personality and get to shine on their instruments and in songwriting on each of those tracks. Each member also wrote their own leitmotif for the album that reoccurs throughout its story. And so while I'm not going to pretend to understand all of the narrative of Quadrophenia because it really isn't all that clear, it does give each member a chance to shine, and the musicianship on this record is pretty fantastic. But even from a songwriting perspective, Quadrophenia is ambitious and excellent. It oftentimes will move away from traditional rock structure and into more cinematic sounding territory, and as some of rock's most spacious and creative use of synthesizers, often using that to create mood and tension throughout the album. That atmosphere only adds to Quadrophenia's cinematic feel, and throughout the album you have a mix of some of the bluesiest and hardest Who songs ever recorded, as well as some of their most symphonic. And while Quadrophenia is wildly ambitious, almost to a fault, it's an album that you don't have to understand the story to enjoy. It has the same strength as Tommy, whereas the songs work in context with the album and are aided by the concept, but work perfectly well as fantastic individual songs. And so whether you dive down the rabbit hole of all of the different narratives and moving parts of Quadrophenia, or just enjoy it as an ambitious and cinematic sounding piece of hard rock, it's a fantastic album and worth going back to 45 years later.
Number 8.
At number 8, we have a pop classic from Stevie Wonder. It is called Innervisions, and while Wonder was certainly popular at the time, in fact, he had just released an exceptionally popular album called Talking Book, where 2 of its singles reached number 1 in the US, Innervisions felt like the album that Wonder had been building to his entire career. And he had had a very long career at this point. Wonder's first album came out at the age of 12, and so by 23, he had already made 16 albums. He had moved away from the Motown sound of his early career into a more expansive mix of genres that includes funk, soul, R&B, jazz, folk, and rock. And it's in this stage of his career where you also start to see his reflections on life and politics of the time. Innervisions is very reflective of social issues of the early 1970s, and this album is a brilliant mix of technical instrumentation, catchy pop music, and social commentary. And while there's a number of love songs as well that break up the commentary, and a sense of optimism that runs through the album, especially on the incredibly catchy single Higher Ground, it's really living in the city that opens this album up. That track is a powerful narrative on systematic racism that sees its main character wind up in jail through a series of systematic issues. It's simply songwriting at its finest, presenting the harsh realities of racism over a funky groove, and mixed in are spoken segments and sounds of the streets of New York that add to that narrative, and it uses some of the strongest, most explicit language that Wonder uses in his entire career, accentuating the power of the song. It provides a stark contrast to the love songs around it, but also features some of Wonder's most virtuosic musical performances. Wonder's vocal performance is nothing short of amazing, not just from a technical perspective, but from the power and range of his voice. And he also plays all of the many instruments on this track, something that is a theme throughout the album, as most of the instruments here are played by Wonder himself. That includes his patented synthesizer, which became very influential for pop and funk music going forward, including artists like Prince and Michael Jackson, but also some of the P-Funk of the later 70s, including Parliament Funkadelic, where you started seeing a lot more synthesizers used in this type of music. And here Wonder uses that synthesizer, as well as all of his other instruments and songwriting, to create an album that sounds both spiritual musically and lyrically. Even amongst all of the politics of this record, songs like Visions, Higher Ground, Don't You Worry About a Thing, all have a sense of idealism, and even the cautionary tales have a semblance of change. And while Innervisions didn't produce the same success in terms of singles that Talking Book did, it immediately became Wonder's most critically acclaimed and celebrated album, and today is up there with Songs in the Key of Life as his best release. It of course influenced the next wave of pop, funk, and R&B, but it's also a fantastic album that holds up, in part because of how talented Wonder is and how strong his songwriting is on this album, but also because it works as a social document for many of the issues going on in America at the time.
Number 7.
This album is called Pakistani Pomade. It was led by the German pianist Alexander von Schlippenbach, and it is an improv session from hell, and it is an improvisational free jazz album that is among the heaviest and most overwhelming jazz albums that I'm aware of from this time. The songs here range from less than 45 seconds to over 10 minutes, and it is just pure chaos. You have long stretches of piano that go in and out of fast technical playing, with times that Schlippenbach sounds like he's just banging on his keys. It features saxophones and drums as well, but embraces the sounds of musique concrète as it uses the whole physical sound of the instruments, including the creaks and cracks and non-musical parts as well as the traditional notes. It makes use of all of the disgusting sounds that can come from a saxophone mouthpiece, as well as the parts of a drum and piano that you can bang on but are not typically used as musical notes. However, that doesn't mean that Pakistani Pomade is impenetrable. Far from it. There's real tension and melody in all of these tracks, including the noisiest of the bunch. It's just a forward-thinking jazz album that saw that this trio of instruments can be used for more than its typical musical range. It clearly builds on the foundation of late 60s European free jazz artists like Peter Brotzmann and Manfred Schuf, who took an even noisier and less structured approach to the American free jazz sounds of John Coltrane, Don Cherry, and Ornette Coleman in the 50s and 60s. But von Schlippenbach created an album here that makes even more use of some of the non-musical sounds in its rhythm and is heavier than a lot of the albums that were made in that European free jazz landscape in the 60s. In fact, I was amazed when I went back and heard this because it sounds so much like modern free jazz albums that we have today. You can tell that John Zorn and Mats Gustafsson were clearly influenced by this record, especially in the way that it plays with spacing and the tension of silence. And even in those tense, quiet moments, the group makes excellent use of creepy sounds as you hear like there's someone walking around or rummaging through something or banging on household objects. It all sounds very eerie, and it gives you that sensation of something in the moment is just a little bit off, but you can't tell what exactly it is. Sometimes a single instrument will come in and play just one note, while other times there are long stretches of the three instruments playing loudly on top of each other. Essentially, it's wild and raucous at times, while also using very light, hushed playing to accentuate the tension. And while it makes sense that this wasn't a huge hit when it came out, as it's not the most accessible thing in the world, it was out of print as well for a long time, essentially re-released in 2003, and fits right alongside many of the avant-garde jazz releases of today. It is very much a classic of this style, and if you are into more experimental music and have not heard this album, this is absolutely one to go back and check out. All I can really say is that it goes in so many interesting directions and is so out there for jazz of the time that it stands out even in a year full of classic jazz releases.
Number 6.
At number 6, we have Sabbath, Bloody Sabbath, the fifth album from British heavy metal pioneers Black Sabbath, who at this point in their career, after creating the metal genre, having a sound that was slow, heavy, and raw, were starting to experiment with different ideas. They had all but perfected the slow, heavy, sludgy sound of their early days with 1971's Master of Reality, and on their last release, Volume 4, they started experimenting with all sorts of different sounds. That album saw the heaviest band in the world recording piano ballads for the first time, using more keyboards, and experimenting with acoustic songs. And so while Sabbath Bloody Sabbath takes a lot of the ideas from Volume 4 and introduces progressive rock into the fold, in many ways it was a return to the heavier sound of their early days, just with new ideas mixed in. The album immediately starts with one of Sabbath's most memorable riffs, their trademark sludgy sound mixed in with progressive undertones in that title track. And mixed into that song is a psychedelic section and some of the acoustic sounding work that the band had used on Volume 4. And Sabbath credits that opening riff for saving the band after a long stretch of writer's block, and you can kind of see that in the rest of the album as the songs to follow build on some of the ideas of the title track. There are new instruments used throughout the record, including synthesizers, piano, a harpsichord, bagpipes. But Sabbath used these new instruments and ideas to show real subtlety in their songwriting. Oftentimes, these new instruments will come in only to create a specific mood or sound here and there, or to mix in a different section. It simply allowed them to create more expansive songs and build upon the foundation that had revolutionized heavy music to begin with. And some of the songs that did go far out of Sabbath's wheelhouse ended up having a tremendous effect on heavy music in the future. You look at a track like Fluff, which is an all-instrumental, acoustic, classical-sounding folk song. This was directly opposed to the type of power ballads that bluesy hard rock bands were writing at the time, and it sounds a lot like what more modern black metal and sludge bands would use to break up some of the heaviness in their sound today. And you could honestly make the case that this was the first progressive metal album. It at least was the first metal album to tap into some of the proggier, more synthesized elements of that genre. And a perfect example of some of these new sounds being used beautifully in their classic approach is Killing Yourself to Live. It's among the best and most creative compositions that Sabbath ever wrote, beautifully mixing in synthesizers and tempo changes into this heavy blues riff. And while I'm not going to say that Sabbath Bloody Sabbath is the absolute best Sabbath album, it is their most ambitious record that works. Every song has some major change to it, but at its core, the riffs here are just so good. Even 3 years after their debut, Sabbath was darker and heavier than anything else around, and even when they did lean into some of the more bluesy sounds of modern hard rock, they did it with an intensity that no other band could match at this time. It wasn't until the late 70s where bands like Judas Priest, Motorhead, and Rainbow started popping up. At this time, it was just Sabbath. So while it didn't necessarily have a lot of competition for the spot, it is very easy for me to say that Sabbath Bloody Sabbath is the best metal album of 1973.
Number 5.
At number 5, it's, well, you already know what this is. Pink Floyd, The Dark Side of the Moon. Everybody knows this album. Everybody loves this album. I can hear the complaints now. This is the greatest album of all time. How is it not number 1? And well, I do love this album. I think it's amazing. It's worthy of a high place on a list full of incredible albums. I just don't think it's the best progressive rock album ever. It's not even the best Pink Floyd album, if we're being honest. That one's the best. But it is a legitimately amazing album. This is one of the most popular, important, and highest selling albums of all time, and for good reason. It's an album that changed production in music forever, allowed psychedelic and progressive music to latch on to a much larger audience than any band had tapped into before. And to this day, you hear its influence in way too many bands to list. This is easily one of the most influential albums ever released, both from a musical standpoint and a production standpoint. Essentially, it's a masterclass of atmosphere and cinematic sounds, with all of these different voices coming in with philosophical quips, as well as the famous clocks and cash registers and all of the different sounds that are outside of a typical musical experience add so much flavor to Dark Side of the Moon. It makes it a philosophical sounding album, and an album that just makes you want to dive deep into it and learn all of the different mysteries and ins and outs. Very rarely has a popular album sounded as mysterious as The Dark Side of the Moon. Everything just sounds so cohesive, even if a lot of the lyrics themselves are a little bit all over the place, dealing with themes of mental health, particularly from former frontman Syd Barrett, who left the band after their first album, The Piper at the Gates of Dawn, and messages of anti-war, anti-commercialism. There is definitely substance to be found in the lyrics of The Dark Side of the Moon, but even to this day, I can't necessarily tell you how all of it fits together. It just sounds like it fits together so perfectly. And in some ways, that's more important. And musically, there's a lot of genius to go around on this record as well, as it was much simpler than some recent Pink Floyd albums like Atom, Mother, Heart and Metal, which saw the band diving deeper into the progressive rock and long-form sounds. However, they started out as a psychedelic rock band, and in some ways, Dark Side of the Moon is a return to their more simplistic pop-length psychedelic sounds, but uses its progressive elements to create an atmosphere that was unlike anything else of the time. But you also have beautifully melodic guitar solos and vocal harmonies and bluesy psychedelia that resonated with a mass audience. And those vocal harmonies, particularly between David Gilmour and sometimes Roger Waters, sometimes Richard Wright, and a ton of different backing vocals used throughout the album, are just simply stunning. It only adds to the atmosphere and the mystery of the record, and took advantage of the modern recording techniques of the time to be able to allow Gilmour to harmonize with the guitar and with these other vocalists more easily. And so yes, I do love Dark Side of the Moon. Its sense of wonder just invites you to look deeper into its messages and lyrics and instrumentation and all of the different voices on the record. I don't think there is necessarily this grand meaning to it, and I don't think that from an instrumental perspective it goes as far or is quite as ambitious as something like Animals or even some of the progressive rock albums that we're going to get to on the rest of the list, but it is an amazing record that of course everyone should hear and is deserving of the accolades that it receives.
Number 4.
At number 4, we have Fare Forward Voyagers, Soldier's Choice, from American folk and American primitivism legend John Fahey. Fahey had recorded a number of quality albums in the 1960s, but was on a streak of mediocre releases before returning to Tahoma Records, his original home, after a failed stint on Reprise. And he comes back with his masterpiece. Fare Forward Voyagers is simultaneously his most meditative and complex album, which is not an easy combination and not things that you necessarily would think of with folk music. This is a beautifully atmospheric album that routinely amazes on a technical level. Fahey's fast fingerpicking is so quick that you often hear multiple guitar sounds at once, and there's a lot of Hindustani influence as well. And because of those influences, this album moves at a circular pace. The rhythm is in circular 16 patterns instead of the usual 4/4. That structure allows Fahey to explore so much of the acoustic guitar, and there's sounds and passages on this thing that I would never expect from an instrument. He's able to make difficult finger picks sound soft, which in and of itself is a tremendous achievement. But from a songwriting perspective, there is so much to this album. Fahey shows mastery over the small details and tones of the guitar and creates tension through power and tempo. And part of the brilliance of Fare Forward Voyagers is that it's progressive in its overall composition despite sounding circular in the moment. These 16-beat patterns allow Fahey to come back to what he was just playing and then add in new sounds. All of it feels so unexpected and like you're being taken on a journey, especially with the length of some of these tracks, as there's only 3 songs on the album and the last one is nearly 25 minutes long. And this structure means that Fahey will never stop, just slow down at times and add new pieces to his music. It's some of the most ambitious and intricate acoustic playing you'll ever hear. And so for those reasons, I would consider Fare Forward Voyagers to not just be a classic of American folk music, but a classic of guitar-based compositions in general, and we rarely include acoustic music in those types of conversations. The songs here, especially that 23-minute title tracks, are almost inconceivable in their scope, and it's just brilliant from start to finish. I cannot recommend it higher.
Number 3.
At number 3, we have the third album from French progressive rock band Magma. It is thankfully abbreviated to MDK because I'm not even going to try to pronounce that. It's not even in a real language. And so yes, the lyrics on this album are in Kobayan, a completely made-up language that Magma created, yet this is a narrative album. And it's brilliant. The music here is just so rich, beautifully layered, and bursting with creativity that few other, if any, prog bands could match. Essentially, Magma was the birthplace of Zool music, an experimental type of progressive rock that uses choral chants, trance-inducing drums, and abrupt style, tempo, and instrument changes. It can often be very intense, but other times be very beautiful with its harmonized choral vocals. But you still have the prog riffs and solos and use of keyboards. It's just a lot more varied and intense than your typical prog album, and there were a number of other bands in France and later Japan that took the same style and even created some of their own languages, very much following in the footsteps of Magma. And MDK, while notable as Magma's breakthrough, is less jazz-oriented than their first 2 releases. It certainly shares a more improvisational sounding jazz structure, but has less actual specific jazz sounds than their previous albums. And all of this may be building to say that the music on here is incredible, and it certainly is, but that the story doesn't make any sense and you can just ignore it. But actually, I think this is pretty fantastic as a narrative album. Essentially, this alien-sounding language that Christian Vander created works because in some ways it is intricate enough where it can tell a 10-album story, and Vander has given clues, including in the liner notes to this album, on how to decipher it. It's more that it works sonically. The vocals sound so passionate and the music varies in intensity so much that you can tell just by that and the motifs scattered throughout the album relatively what's going on in a general sense of the story. No, you're not going to be able to pick up on all of the details, and you certainly are invited to go down a Magma rabbit hole and figure all of it out, but I actually kind of like how vague a lot of it is. It gives you just enough information in the music itself to hear an arc of a story, but doesn't give you all of the explicit details. For example, there are militaristic drums and chants that sound like marching that make you think of an impending war or conflict. There's gospel-tinged moments that have this sense of more spirituality or epiphanies, as well as sections of this frantic maximalist sound that infer battle. And overall, it just all sounds epic. There's a moment towards the back half of this record, right when you expect the conflict to be at its heaviest point, where the vocals become strained and you hear this operatic scream unlike anything I've heard in rock music before. And I like that everyone, regardless of language, will start at square one with this album. And by today's standards, where so many bands have been influenced by the likes of King Crimson and Rush and Pink Floyd, you end up hearing a lot of the same exaggerated motifs in progressive rock music. Magma sounds more like a Wagner-esque rock opera, and it's hard to say how much of Magma's music and MDK as an album is intended to be parody or just the most pretentious thing in the world, but it works on some level. And I understand how out there all of this sounds, but with all of its changes in intensity and style, it is such a wild ride to be a part of.
Number 2.
At number 2, we have the 12th album from Herbie Hancock. It is called Headhunters. It was the first platinum-selling jazz album, and it is one of the biggest crossover jazz records ever released. In 1973, this was a hit among rock, funk, and soul fans, and was even divisive among jazz fans because it was such a huge crossover record and on its surface sounded much simpler than jazz albums of its time. However, it quickly found a wide audience and today is one of the most influential jazz albums of all time and a pillar of the fusion scene along with Miles Davis's Bitches Brew. And in many ways, this is the inverse of the massively complex arrangements in Bitches Brew, as this was much more melodic and more inviting to the listener and sounded futuristic. And because of that, this album sounds modern to this day. It revolutionized how to integrate funk, R&B, and African music into a jazz structure, and the first track on the album, Chameleon, an absolute classic of the genre, doesn't even start out like a jazz song. Just listening to the opening groove, you would think you're about to listen to a funk record. The main grooves on this thing are not just good for a jazz album, but attention-grabbing for a funk album as well. A saxophone will come in very simply and smoothly, but it will then start playing far outside of the melody, but because it is so well integrated, it never feels like it's breaking the melodic trance that Headhunters always has you in. And while all 4 of the songs on this album are classic, they are all distinctly different from each other despite building off of the last one. And part of the brilliance of Headhunters is that the band can sound easygoing while oftentimes playing complex music. It turns the freeform nature of jazz music into something so catchy and is able to mix in lighter synth elements and an unmistakable groove. It's an album that you can dance to, think to, and vibe to. And in the 45 years since its release, Hancock's work here has continued to transcend genre, as it influenced the jazzier sides of electronic music and hip-hop music and is routinely sampled in those genres to this day. And because of that, this is the first album that I recommend to people trying to get into jazz music. It's just so funky and melodic and still has the complexity of jazz. It's not watered down or pedestrian in any way, just more inviting. It just wraps it up in such a timeless and approachable sound that it can make a jazz fan out of anyone, even today.
Number 1.
And our number 1 album of 1973 is Future Days, the 5th album from German krautrock band Can, legitimately one of the greatest, most innovative, and quietly most influential bands in modern music history. They were an immediate influence on progressive rock and electronic at the time, but ended up influencing indie and punk bands like Sonic Youth and Radiohead, as well as all sorts of indie rock bands to follow. Essentially, their fingerprint is on a lot of modern music. And Future Days was their last album with vocalist Damo Suzuki, ending 3 consecutive years of masterful albums, starting with 1971's Tego Mego, then going to 1972's Ige Bamyasi, and ending with Future Days, the most atmospheric and ambient of them all. And if you don't know what krautrock is, it's a German style of rock music that literally translates to cosmic music. It certainly was a part of the progressive rock of the 70s, but was more experimental, doubled down on the psychedelia, and introduced more electronic elements. I've heard krautrock described as rock music without the blues, and while I think that's an apt description in general for the genre, Future Days exemplifies that probably more than any other. It takes its main influence from the improvisation and layering of jazz music and creates a mood all its own because of it. Even by Can standards, this is an experimental album, as it takes some of the ambient noise of Ige Bamyasi and evolves it into a long-form structure, while other times using that to create something upbeat and danceable, such as on the completely infectious pop track Moonshake. Can plays with volume dynamics throughout the album, using slurred lyrics and hushed vocals, and every sound tier, including the vocals, are used as texture. The vocals sound less like a way of conveying lyrics and more like an instrument in and of themselves. It also has all types of hushed experimental sounds, such as birds chirping and water running, but it often hides how experimental it actually is with its chill vibe. It's so mellow, yet consistently mesmerizing in how these tracks come together. And the huge reason for that is all of the unusual drum patterns that are used. It's the basis on which the album is layered. A lot of these songs have a fast, trance-like drumming that, despite its speed, doesn't feel intense at all. Again, sometimes it's danceable, other times it's completely atmospheric. And 1973 was such a monumental year for progressive rock. Of course, this is the 3rd progressive rock album on this list, and there were others that I considered as well. But it's clear in going back and listening to all of them that Future Days was easily the most forward-thinking and modern-sounding prog rock album to come out this year. It feels contemporary with the types of jazz and electronic music released this year, and in many ways exemplifies all of the different wonderful music released 45 years ago. It's truly progressive in every sense of the word, and I hear bits of this album in not just progressive rock, but in electronic, ambient, psychedelic, punk, indie, post-rock, and new age. And even with all of that, there is still nothing quite like Future Days. Even compared to other Can albums, this is so distinct in their discography and has a vibe that no one else could replicate. It is, in my opinion, the best album in 1973 and one of the crowning musical achievements of this era. And those are my top 10 albums of 1973. Thanks so much for watching, and as always, you can like, subscribe, hit that notification bell so you know when new videos are posted, and as always, let me know what you think in the comments. Agree with anything, disagree with anything, think I missed any albums? Let me know. I know there are some popular ones that didn't make the cut. It's okay, you can tell me about them. Have at it. You can also check out other videos from Bryce about music by clicking near my head over here, and we'll have more videos coming soon, including more countdowns and a recap of the best albums released in the last month as we're closing out August here. So thanks again. I'm out.